I want to start today by acknowledging that most of us attending today are on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin from time immemorial, and that these ancestral Puyallup lands are covered by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We acknowledge the tribal governments and people's leadership in taking care of these lands. So especially at a sustainability summit, I think it's worth acknowledging that there is an immense wealth of knowledge within our Indigenous communities to take care of our world that frankly our country is ignoring. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Our very first guest, I can't tell you how excited I am to hear from Shin-pei. Shin-pei Tsay is the Director of Global Policy for Cities and Transportation at Uber. Our virtual format this year allows us to have speakers from a little further afield. Shin-pei and I went to the same graduate school, but I don't actually know her. And I reached out to her on LinkedIn and told her about the mission of this event and asked if she might be interested in speaking, and she was incredibly gracious in giving us her time. So Shin-pei is going to talk to us about why we count beyond sustainability. And if you have any questions for Shin-pei, we're going to have some time at the end of her talk, and this is true for all of the speakers today. So if you have questions, please put them in a chat with starting with Shin-pei so that I know that the question is for her. My name's Allison. I probably should have started with that. So if the question is for me, just say, Allison, I have a question. And then at the end of Shin-pei's talk, we're going to have some time for questions, and I'll pick a few from the chat to ask Shin-pei just for simplicity, because at some points in the call, we may have up to 40 or 50 people. So I'm going to turn it over to Shin-pei. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, hi. Great. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Good. Well, it's really great to be here. When Allison invited me, this seemed like such a community that was already so rich and full and supportive. And I am just honored to think that I have something to say and add this morning. Thank you, Allison, for asking me to be a part of this. So what I wanted to talk to you about, it's a phrase that has resonated with me recently, and that phrase is why we count. And as Allison mentioned, I'm currently a policy director at Uber, but before that, I founded a impact analysis firm called Make Public. And the idea of our little firm was to quantify the unquantifiable, especially around the public realm. It's a lot of real counting, and here's an example of what that means. When engineers design crosswalks, they time them at the average speed of a pedestrian. That's 4.3 miles per hour if you're a man. Of course, this only takes into account able-bodied men, never mind seniors or children who must be most protected when crossing the street. And a lot of our built environment is defined by these kinds of metrics: the speed of travel, the miles of bike lanes, the number of riders. But the most perfectly engineered street might actually be boring and not fun to walk down and not great for business. How many people have walked down the street that's really blah? Nothing to look at, nothing to do, just a long stretch of a blank wall. And how many people have walked down a street that's just delightful, and before you know it, you've walked for miles and have forgotten about your sore feet? So how do you measure that? That's what Make Public was about. And the idea behind why we count is to try to measure the human dimension of our built environment, to put numbers on important things, social things, like sense of belonging or active facades. And it builds on the work of Jan Gehl, a Danish architect who pioneered human-centered design in architecture and urban planning. What we were trying to do is quantify things like being able to fit together, to move chairs around and give people a sense of agency, built environments that are conducive to talking while you're walking and having that social public life. And so why we count in this case is why people count when we think about things that might be more hard, like architecture or engineering or transportation. But as I thought about what I wanted to share with you today, and this theme of why we count started to show up in earlier experiences too. About 12 years ago, I worked in bicycle advocacy, which was really intimidating to me. It involves speaking up a lot by yourself at community board meetings. And maybe some people here have been to, but I've given talks at so many public forums. including ones with thousands of people, but nothing makes me more nervous than a community board meeting. And the good thing about advocacy is that there's this amazing culture of civics. What I mean by that is, the ability to identify the policies that matter, knowing who makes them, knowing where power lies, knowing the tools that can change them, and then ruthlessly going after it, knowing that you're worth something, that your opinion matters. And at this point in my life, when I started bicycle advocacy, I didn't do as much public speaking. And as an immigrant, as an immigrant for most of my life, I really tried not to stand out too much. So standing up and talking at meetings was terrifying. But advocacy taught me that you could and do this. And it taught me that what I thought about the city I lived in mattered and should be included in how agencies get things done. So that's why we count mattered again. And at the same time, I also saw how bike advocacy could also not see many experiences that really mattered in the public realm. There was a lot of mode shaming about car use when many low-income folks didn't have another way of traveling long distances. There was complete ignorance about Black and Brown experiences. Things as benign as not realizing that going for a jog for a Black man looks really different than it does for a white man. A lot of ignorance around violent policing. And there was avoidance about gender and how those dynamics also create unsafe spaces on our streets. So that's another reason why we count. I thought about why we count for people who often aren't acknowledged in the process of shaping cities. So after bicycle advocacy, I went to a foreign think tank to work on climate change and transportation and urban issues. And metrics, again, here made such a big difference. How hundreds of millions of dollars were poured into the quantifiable elements of climate change, like how much carbon emissions could be decreased through renewable energy and vehicle electrification. But there was no consideration of public transit or walking or biking or much, much less, because it was so hard to count when people made those trips. Cars, emissions from cars, very countable. People powering themselves or through public means, very uncountable. And things have changed a bit since then, but I worry that we continue to be vulnerable to solutions that only include numbers that we already know, rather than understanding that we cannot count everything that matters. And there's a human dimension, especially, that's really hard to quantify. For a long time, climate change activists wanted to avoid conversations about adaptation because they worried that it gave policymakers an escape hatch from mitigation strategies, the really hard stuff, especially strategies that showed up well in the numbers. But at this point, in the midst of all of that, we now have to account for climate displacement and relocation of whole communities. And that includes culture, history, and other elements that are social and not countable. And those social impacts do count, or relocation policies won't succeed, and we'll have a whole bunch of other problems on our hands. And that is why we continue to count. So recently, in my current role, I was shaping Uber's carbon reduction commitment. And part of this was getting the business to agree to the targets, since they would need to deliver on them. But I was surprised that the approach they were taking was to try to make today's known numbers work for the future. When we are talking about change, we want to aim for that is 10 or 20 years away. So the solutions we need to fight climate change and rapidly carbonize the world will require leaps of faith. And I believe that it will require an embrace of the social impacts of the work, not an avoidance. So trying to make today's number work when we're talking about a radical transformation made so little sense, but they eventually got there. And I think even more importantly, this was a huge opportunity to include communities that have been left out of sustainability. One part of our commitment is to focus on drivers on the ride-hail platform. We saw from some focus groups that drivers were particularly vulnerable during COVID. The majority of vulnerable drivers, defined by having lost some income, having had a sick family member, or some other kind of negative household impact, were primarily women and people of color and of lower incomes. So we felt it was really important to design a commitment that met the needs of the drivers who use the platform, and that we had to do it in a way that met them where they are. So we partner with a couple of environmental justice organizations, EV Noir and Grid Alternatives, to make sure that the $800 million resource the company was directing toward drivers reached drivers who would benefit the most. So don't get me wrong, the point of the electrification commitment is not to replicate, the car dominant built environment that we currently live in today, but thinking about all the past experiences I had, I was thinking a lot about, rather than forcing travel choices, about meeting people where they are and to include their needs in the work and employing all the strategies we can have access to at the same time as much as we can to get to the sustainability that we want that is also inclusively livable. And without doing this, we could have simply helped boost the Tesla market share. And that is simply not the point of any massive climate change goal. Having people who aren't just focused on numbers and who can speak to the human dimension is what made this possible. So, during this time of great wokeness, let's say, and when people are going through so much new realizations, I have been asked to speak at a lot of panels and even about racial justice and in transportation equity in particular. And I've really struggled to, in many conversations, name what I'm trying to name, to say racism, to say that something is racist. And I was just reflecting on this a lot recently because of these conversations. And I had this great conversation this week with a leader in transportation and racial justice, Tamika Butler. And I had this realization that I wanted to share with you today that just kind of brings this theme closer to me and makes it much more personal. And I realized that I've had experiences where people don't believe me when I've been discriminated against, when I say that it's racism. And their first reaction is to point out all the ways that it isn't racist. And the worst way that is when they point it out, when they point out how well another Asian is being treated as proof. They hired her and she's doing great, so how can they be racist against you? And so, as I think about why we count, I was just thinking about my journey and how I got to this point. And I think maybe it's because people don't expect Asian women to express anger and frustration in professional meetings or to be openly critical. I think at the time, I think I see so many white men get to do it, and so why not me? But I really admit, I do regret it afterwards. It's like quiet shame for not behaving in the way that people expect me to. And so I had this flashback, and I realized that this started so long ago, that 20 years ago, after being told that we should focus on white applicants for an internship program, that because those are the ones who rise to positions of power, I tried to report this incident to the Office of Equal Employment in New York City. It was a well-known nonprofit. I was an executive leader in the organization at the time, and I felt a really huge responsibility for writing this racist culture. This is 20 years ago, something I was sure should cost us something. That we should, we would risk losing our nonprofit status, for example, or not get foundation funding. And, maybe I was young. I documented the emails and even had a conversation log and brought them with me to the interview. And the officer there was really nice and gentle as he explained that actually there wasn't a way for the agency to take action. In fact, in the eyes of the law, I was proof that they weren't racist because I still had my job after I yelled at the guy who sent that racist message around the office. And I think this silencing really kind of stayed with me for a long time. And later I got called into the CEO's office, and that guy I yelled at was his son. As I said, I was young at that time and just really couldn't help myself. And, he basically told me I wasn't allowed to yell at him because what he had done was not wrong. And that's what made me crack. I was able to deal with weeks of being professional, if somewhat angry and immature, but being told to my face that it was not racist made me burst into tears. Do you realize how hard it is for someone like me to even say anything? I asked. So clearly this is not an organization I stayed at for much longer. But in this moment, so many years later, when I find myself struggling to name the thing sometimes, the story just came back. It made me realize that there are many ways that people have helped me succeed, who saw that I mattered, but they have perhaps muffled me in many other ways. And so I wanted to share that because we can't keep these secrets any longer, that I count and that all of you count, and that we as women, we really matter in this work towards sustainability. And I guess finally, what I wanted to do was just wrap up with a really short story that continues to be personal, but resonates with this theme. I had a baby a couple of years ago while I was the executive director of a high profile but very small nonprofit. So I got asked to speak all the time, join boards, and basically it was because I was a nonprofit employee, basically volunteered time for high profile things. And when the baby came, I found myself constantly needing to pump just as the panel started, or needing to be at the board meeting just as the baby's dinner time came around. And I just kept thinking, like, if we need to create a sustainable world that our children can inherit, we women have to understand that we count as well. We can't continue to fight the good fight. So that's why we count. We as women and de-identifying, people of color, tribes, immigrants, people with privilege, and many, many people with not, all count. And all of you matter in this fight for sustainability. You're the ones who count. So thanks. I'm so glad I can share some of these stories with you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Shin-pei. I made a couple of notes. One of the things that I really liked about what you said was that we have to give people agency, right? We have to create spaces that make people feel like they have choices. And I think that that's something that's really helpful to take into when we're talking about spaces, the physical spaces that we're creating, online platforms that we're creating, that if you create everything in a way that only works for one sort of type of people, that there's this whole, huge group that you're missing out on, which is actually one of the reasons that I started this event 3 years ago, because I had been to so many sustainability sort of events as a climate policy person. And they were all of the panels were old white dudes, and all of the spaces were old white dudes. And it was very much like that I was allowed to be there, but I wasn't allowed to be important in those spaces. And I constantly got passed over to talk on those panels because there was a guy in the office who would do it. And he was terrible. He was terrible at panels, but he would always get asked because that was the front that the nonprofit wanted to put forward. And so this event was created out of the idea that there are people who are completely left out of the sustainability conversation because they're micro businesses or because they don't have a background in environmentalism. And I wanted to create something that was accessible to more people, but also like started from a point of like, what can we actually do? Not like, here's how you afford an electric car, because that's not reasonable for everyone, but more like, how do we actually move forward in our daily lives and in our daily businesses and achieve something impactful? And so the one of the questions that we have for you is along those lines. Julie Davidson asks, what are some critical qualitative metrics that small business women might consider when opening brick and mortar spaces?
Yeah, thanks, Allison, and thanks for your story as well. I think I was in some of those same circles, and just remember being really intimidated as I sometimes got invited to speak, and initially impressed by people who didn't seem to prepare, and then eventually completely disgusted by the lack of effort some people would put. And there was always men, and even today, if someone tells me like, oh, I'm not going to bother, blah, XYZ on that panel, I'm just like, do not be that person. Do not be that guy. Make an effort. You owe it to your audience to respect the audience this time. And I think a lot, I think that kind of rings similar kind of themes in how we think about our built spaces, to respect the people who are trying to use it. And so great question about, you know, some of the things you might think about when you think about brick and mortar spaces. There's often, this sounds really funny, but there's often not enough seating. And if you want people to kind of linger or, you know, stay a while, it's always nice to provide seating, make sure it's kind of wheelable space for strollers, for wheelchairs, for people who might need a little extra help getting around. Those are some physical things, but I think some of the qualitative things are, you know, are there places where there's kind of a sense of intimacy and comfort? And so there's an idea of like the spaces that are very open and vast, and then allowing people to kind of squeeze together and be close together. And there's something about that in really well-designed stores where you can have great sight lines, but then these this like experience of moving around that gives you like that little moment of intimacy as you're moving about. So I love those kinds of spaces that really invite kind of a sense of lingering, a kind of exploration. And so I think happy to share other things. I would look at something that just came out from Yangel's team called Soft City. It's a book by David Sims, who's the creative director at the Gale practice. And it talks a lot about the ways humans experience the built environment and the things that you could consider as you're kind of designing those kinds of places.
Thank you. We have a couple of really awesome questions. One question is, in the car sharing industry, how do you balance the need to pay drivers fairly while not making the service only accessible to riders with money? Is the C-suite willing to make concessions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, and I specifically in ride hail, there's the idea of, you know, I think the service as it stands, I mean, before ride hail, there was taxi, right? And I think a lot of people have had the experience of not really having experiences with taxi. Like it was always kind of a crapshoot. And also taxis didn't have to go to a lot of neighborhoods. They could deny a ride and no one would ever know. And so there's an increase in access already with ride hail because it has a platform that connects people, and you can't, there are protections around rejection of passengers, and it goes both ways because drivers experience racism as well. And so it kind of goes both ways, like having to support both sides of that experience. But I think, you know, the options that have been developed to try and make that platform more accessible is to, you know, there are a few different things. One, before COVID, there was pool rides, so you could share a ride with someone and split the cost. We were looking at a lot of different ways of trying to make that more efficient, so that it just got better matching, better route matching, better kind of pickup drop off. There's also transit integration now on the platform so that you can plan a journey with ride hail, maybe to like the regional train station. Like I'm right now based in San Francisco. And if I typed in San Jose, like the idea there is I could take potentially a ride hail to the train station and then catch the train. And that is a much less expensive version of trying to get to San Jose from here. And trying to kind of open ourselves up to more diverse transportation options. We've added micromobility. There's bikes and scooters in 55 cities through the app. But I think this is a constant issue, right? This is not high volume public transit, doesn't get any subsidies. And so how do we continue to balance that? And I think that there's constant tweaking of trying to make sure that we're, you know, people and creating an affordable service for what it is, which is on-demand transportation.
Thank you. I think we'll do two more questions. The first one is Knowing our worth as women and leaders is important, and feeling grounded and asserting our worth absolutely matters. That said, there's also something powerful about contributing to a culture where each individual woman doesn't have to be the one to assert her value. How do we get there? How can the collective we assert our value? You got 5 minutes.
I got 5 minutes? Oh,
no,
God,
I'm joking. That's like a really big question. Take us in time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think that's like probably all the coffee conversations or the breakout rooms you're going to have today is to talk a lot about this. One thing that I countered this with another in conversation with someone who is a leader in this space is just about power itself and how at this in our careers we you know, as I said, like I get asked to join boards. We're in the room, we're at the table, and then it's you know, what happens. I don't have a lot of access to then models of what happens. Like I think being at nonprofits for the majority of my career, being the person of color, the immigrant, the woman, I've been about the other person constantly in many of these situations. And so now that there's growing openness to making the table bigger or being, you know, being part of the room, what happens? And we were no good solutions, like no silver bullets, but a lot of the conversation was around actually needing to get other folks to give up power to continue to distribute and include and invite and continue to make space for others. It's really hard and tiring to be the person that's constantly speaking up. And so there's a lot of, I think, trying to get others to come around to the ideas or, you know, actually showing and modeling that behavior. So Allison, looks like you're wanted to add something.
Oh, I did, but I wasn't sorry if I was interrupting you with like my facial expression. One of the things that I have been very frustrated with in Tacoma in particular, but this is a really widespread problem, is that I get asked to be on boards and like commissions and things like that. And I know that some of the people on this call have served on commissions in Tacoma and it's unpaid. So they ask you to volunteer sometimes upwards of 6 hours a month. And when I was being asked to do this, I had little kids and I was like, you're asking me to give up time with my family and not compensating me. And then Tacoma keeps putting out calls and asking for more diverse candidates and different kinds of candidates and unusual candidates. And I'm like, you are not going to get them unless you start compensating people for their time. 6 hours a month is a lot to ask of someone to volunteer if they are working a minimum wage job, or if they are working 2 jobs, or if they have little kids at home, or if they're a single parent. And so I think one of the things that we're going to have if we want to be in spaces where there's more than one woman or more than one mom or more than one low income person is that these boards and commissions and things like that are not volunteer, that they're compensated. I think that that's really important. That's kind of a pet like project of mine, is to like raise that whenever they put out calls, be like, well, when are you going to offer compensation or even offer childcare, right? Like if you're not going to offer compensation, then offer childcare so that people can attend this without literally costing themselves money of getting a babysitter. Okay, we have one more question for you. What does the decision table look like at Uber, and what strategies do you use to bring your ideas to the table to be heard and taken seriously?
Oh, thanks for the question. It's tough. I've only been at Uber for a year, literally. So I feel like I've been on this like really long learning journey. I've been in nonprofit world for almost 20 years, or I think 20 years at least. And so it's a very, very different culture. A couple of observations I was just, as I was reflecting around the year, because it was my anniversary recently there, and I was just reflecting on the culture there. A couple of observations. It's a very egalitarian place, so it's only a 10-year company. So there's a lot of great, smart, go-getting people, very, very smart people, but they don't have a lot of the social dimension that I was, you know, like really trying to get to. They don't have managerial experience. They don't have leadership experience. Their leadership experience might have only been at Uber. That was the only time they ever managed people. That was the only time they ever, you know, got a chance to hone those kind of soft skills, let's say. And so there's that piece of it where I think because of that, there's a really strong emphasis on metrics and outcomes, and also as a tech company. So maybe those of you who work in technology, like all like OKRs and the KPIs and these acronyms are like really new to me. In nonprofit world, you're like creating strategic plans that might be 3 to 5 years. You know, you're like aiming for this long-term impact. In tech world, you're like, you have like 6-month plans. So I think there was this kind of like egalitarianism and a metrics orientation that I think, as I said, I was like a critic of metrics, right? So I could go in and kind of talk that language and try to craft KPIs for some of the goals that I wanted, which was like inclusion, better treatment of drivers, more support for Black and Brown communities, you know, actually addressing equity, systemic equity, equity about, you know, longstanding problems with our, you know, where people have to live and where they have to work. So there's that piece of it. And I think then the second piece is that in spite of all of that, in spite of the reliance on metrics, I also came to realize over the course of this year that, you know, relationships do matter. If you've been there for 6 years, you know a lot of people. You probably know the head of the entire business unit at that point. He's probably been there for 4 years, 6 years too. And there's that soft power, right? Of knowing who to go to that actually has authority to make that change. And I feel like that's sort of like the next stage of that I need to learn how to do is to like, who are those people? Title actually doesn't matter so much, right? As people here probably know, right? It's like who can actually get that thing done, and knowing how to kind of be in the arena and kind of grapple with it. Something I've really had to learn as I'm also trying to manage these relationship building kinds of things. It's all happening in the background, right? Like you're not like going to work being like, I need to develop this relationship. You're just trying to get stuff done. But something I really need to manage is like my discomfort with sounding too critical, or like you're hearing my discomfort by when I just use the phrase too critical. What I meant to say was just the discomfort with sounding critical. And I am always afraid of sounding too critical. But again, it's a metrics oriented, speak up, egalitarian place. So it's totally okay to do that. It's okay to sound critical, which is something I'm getting used to. And so I think that's how I'm trying to make these things happen. And then finally, I have to say, like, it is not perfect, right? There are so many things that any gigantic company does that you're going to disagree with. And I'll be totally upfront about it. It's, to be honest, on orientation, so I have been a critic of the company for much of my career, and agreed to do this because I felt like there was an opening to potentially shift the direction. And I was like pretty soaked in terms of like the policies that Uber has stood up, et cetera, on some things, on the transportation side of things, I would say. And then during orientation, I got there and I was like, oh my God, I had no idea there's 29,000 people working here. I had no idea. Like literally had no idea. It's like, what? I thought it was like, you know, it was a 10-year-old tech company. I had no idea it was that global. It was, you know, at that point they had like living at 600 cities, and I had no idea. So I'm learning a lot every day.
Thank you so much, Shin-pei. We really, really appreciate you being here. I'm so thankful that we had the capacity to do this virtually this year so that you could join us. And we just really appreciate your insights, and thank you.